The state of private sector publishing in Africa has never been steady historically. Shifts have happened between government taking center stage in publishing and distributing textbooks. And in other cases, it has been private sector publishing and government buying through tenders. And these two positions have shifted in most of the African countries. In East Africa, where about 45 publishers are publishing, they fall within the three groups. Group one can be exemplified by Kenya and to some extent Rwanda, where private sector is publishing all materials for schools and also for the open market. In Tanzania, we have government which is producing textbooks and distributing them, while private publishers produce supplementary materials, with a difference, because the supplementary materials that are being produced with government approval have no market, because funds are still concentrated in the hands of the government. In other states like South Sudan, they do not have indigenous publishers who are publishing. They have foreign publishers from the region who are publishing for Rwanda. So those are the three groups that are operating in the East African region. Challenges. Each group has a different challenge. Group one, for example, the challenge is ensuring that all people in the country are getting access to books, in which case they have to form alliances with the public library system, which can run outreach programs, because the more people have access to books, the greater the market. Challenge for the publishers where government is participating in textbook publishing is actually convincing the government that private sector publishing is central to creating an informed society, and therefore finding ways of supporting private publishers to produce books for schools and for the open market. Challenge for the other group where either indigenous publishers are few or very weak is for them, of course, they cannot compete with foreign publishers, but they have an opportunity of seeking out co-publishing arrangements with stronger publishers in the region. With respect to the two scenarios where either private sector is publishing, but books are not being accessed to all people in the country, and where government is publishing and private sector is not publishing. What I learned from those situations and the constant shifts between the two is that we need a new model, a model that is more inclusive. The model that is operating right now for Tanzania, for example, is publishing serving only a segment of readers who are only mostly primary and secondary schools, while there are a lot of other people who need books. There are professionals who need books, vocational training people who need books. There are many people out there in the public system who need books. There are children who did not go to school, who are growing up illiterate, and they need books to read. So we cannot have a model that focuses on only one segment of book needs. We need to have an inclusive model that takes into consideration all those. Now, this is important because book provision is more complex than I think we think. Book provision is constantly changing because the wider environment is constantly changing. Development needs are changing. There are too many changes, both in learning and teaching approaches, the kind of information needs that people need, because the global environment influences all countries. they influence local situations, so that when things change in the global environment, there is need to adapt. And whoever is using books and learning needs to have new methodology of teaching, and therefore a new varieties of books all the time. So we need that model to be able to serve the majority of people within the country, rather than just a small segment of readers. Book distribution has been, to the rural areas, has been difficult for a very long time. And this is because publishers and all the other actors in the book chain are involved, are working in towns and cities. They are not found in rural areas. And the result of this situation is that books are not known to most people in the rural areas. The importance of books is not known to people in the rural areas. So the place where you find books is only in schools, in primary schools, which you find in almost any remote village will have at least. Publishers need to find out, or people, all actors in the book chain need to find out, for example, why does products like sugar, salt, matchboxes, how do they happen to reach the remotest of villages, while books do not, or books cannot? There must be a reason. Although reaching the remote villages depends on tarmac roads that end at district level, and therefore books have tended to end at district level. But we need to get books to the people needing them. So we need to explore what channels does other private sector use to get those products into the remote areas, and then come to have arrangements with them. This is made easy because there is now the use of smartphones that can reach, that everybody has, mostly. Most people have smartphones, so communication between the village and the town is no longer a problem. It's no longer a challenge. So we need to explore that so that we can create book collection centers in the rural areas where the schools are. There are rural libraries in the rural areas. Not many, but they are there. We need to explore, one, how to establish as many rural libraries as possible and make them book collection centers, because libraries are naturally learning and reading centers. They naturally bring teachers, students, professionals into the library. So they would serve very adequately as book collection centers for, say, a cluster of schools. So we need to explore how we can use those. Use the ones that exist now, and then continue lobbying for the establishment of others. A sustainable distribution model will come out of our own exploration and efforts to see how we can use existing structures. How can we use existing structures to make them book-friendly, to make them accept books as a product, or to accept books purely for collection by schools? Because these structures, all of them are rural people who have children going to school. So they have vested interest in becoming a collection center. Modes of how payment models can always be worked out. So I think there will be a sustainable book distribution only when we use existing structures. It is difficult to establish new structures that will only deal with books. It is good, it's much better to integrate books within structures that already exist and that are selling other products. So it's not like we have a distribution model right now, but we can work at it. And I think the private sector should take up the challenge. However, before we have a model, before we have a sustainable model for publishing in Africa, I think private sector has proved to be able to distribute books all the way to the schools. In Tanzania, for example, in 2013-2014, private sector publishing was able to distribute books. Each publisher used their own means. That means it is possible. And some of them used precisely the structures that exist in rural areas, in remote towns, They use those structures because, one, people in remote areas know where the schools are. They know the teachers because their children go to school there. So it is possible, with careful planning, to actually do distribution to the school level. It has been done. I think that can be done. Also, there's another example of CODE established a rural library in Lindi, and people were reading until 11 p.m. That could be a very effective distribution collection point for books. You see, books do not have to reach the school, but they can reach somewhere in the community within a short distance so that they can collect books from there. So I think things are happening now, and with a bit more effort, we could sit down and see how we can evolve a sustainable distribution model. Reading culture is truly a challenge because you can never achieve a reading culture that remains constant without making efforts to sustain it. Reading culture is sustained by two aspects, in my view. One is policy. Book and education policies that state clearly that there will be libraries in schools and there will be libraries in the communities, and these libraries will be stocked by a very clearly stated mechanism that says books will be sent to school libraries through this mechanism and to community libraries through a mechanism that is clearly known. After establishing the mechanism and being and policies spelling out how, we need a continuous access of those books to communities and to schools. It is not a one-off effort. One-off effort was tried in Tanzania. The books were all read to shreds, and then the libraries disappeared because there was no restocking of libraries. Libraries are expensive for that reason. They need constant stocking of different varieties of books, carrying new ideas for people to read and learn and enjoy, you know. So one of the most important things is political will for governments to invest in sustaining a reading culture, because it's not something that is easy, that can be done within 3 years of promotion and then we leave it there. It has to be constantly addressed. It's definitely getting worse. One, it is getting worse because these facilities, like rural libraries, like community libraries, do not exist. So people have no access to books. Access is only found in schools. And then the moment children graduate from primary schools, they get into communities where there's nothing to read. And within 2 to 3 years, they've fallen back into illiteracy or semi-literacy. They join their companions who did not go to school, who have grown up illiterate. And they join the informal sector without any skills, either reading skills, comprehension skills, math skills, nothing. So actually, it's getting worse. And this cohort, this group of people who are slowly becoming illiterate, increases every year, because every year people are leaving school in millions into the communities where there are no reading materials. So really, this situation must be arrested. And it has to be arrested by a common interest between the private sector and the government to find out ways, most cost-effective ways of stocking community libraries and school libraries. The opportunity in promoting literacy is seen in private sector full participation in the production of books for all reading needs, for those who are learning to read, for those who can read, for professionals who need professional material to read and advance themselves for all people who need to read. I think that is a great opportunity because I think it is possible. It is possible for that to happen. When you talk of Africa-wide context, if you talk of Africa-wide context, we have APNET, which is a publishers, African Publishers Network. And they have been coordinating a project that I found very interesting. This is producing and calling publishers to produce books on SDG goals, one goal at a time. And the lesson I get from there is that APNET could coordinate also translations of books from one language to another. They could coordinate adaptation of books and therefore have a cross-culture situation happening in different countries. East African publisher can produce a book from West African publisher. Southern African publisher can produce a book from Eastern African publishing, and therefore we crossbreed ideas. So that is a great opportunity, and I think with the existence of APNET, that according to a research done by APNET in 2019, there are about 11 African countries whose universities are running publishing programs. Now, these are coordinated with other departments, but 2 are independent programs, and that is found in Zimbabwe and Ghana. This would provide big opportunities for African publishers because they could be lobbied to restructure their programs so that they can address a wider variety of needs from the African publishers. But they need to be lobbied and convinced and take up the challenge of becoming the centers of publishing studies in Africa. And I think that too is not impossible. I think it can be done. Publishers Association do run trainings, but they are irregular and they are one-off. It's not, they don't have yearly programs that are stable and that allow publishers to plan training for their personnel. So that is a challenge. That kind of training is not adequate. And yet African publishers need training because the world is changing. Book needs are changing. Book designs are changing. Everything is changing in the information world. So African publishers need training. Training in-house is not something one can rely on because it depends on the training skills, on the skills that exist within a house, a publishing house. And if the skills are not strong enough, they cannot be relied upon to train, to impart to others. So we need a reliable training program that African publishers can send their personnel there depending on the training needs that they have. So that, you know, we reduce some of the challenges that we get. And today, there is digital publishing. And it's a big challenge for most African publishers. So really, we need training in that respect. That the existing situation is not conducive. We need to have facilities for training African publishers.